Thank you. Please let me begin by thanking John Dijak and Emil Doak for inviting me and for all those who worked so hard to put this together. I was here yesterday and it was in its final form almost, and I was just struck at how many hands it took to build this and to make all of this possible. So thank you very much for the invitation. A couple of caveats before I begin, and these are more for the philosophers and political philosophers who are here today. I want to make some caveats for them. First, though my topic is the contemplative statesman, please know that I am not of the guild of philosophers or political philosophers. I am, in fact, a musician, and that gives me a citizenship in the guild of poets. In light of the theme of this conference and a nearly 2,000-year feud running between the philosophers and the poets, one could argue that it was almost heretical to invite me to address you here today. I am a poet-musician, and I should not be talking to you about anything having to do with running or founding a republic. But I think I can say without fear of contradiction that Plato would certainly disapprove of my presence here today. Second, I do not have any allegiances when it comes to political philosophy. I am not now, nor have I ever been, a Straussian of the East Coast or West Coast variety. Though with much profit in graduate school, I did get to read Father Ernest Fortin's essays on political philosophy. Nor am I a Vogelinian, though I learned a great deal from Peter Sampo, who was himself a student of Eric Vogelin. But if there are those among us here today of a certain sort who are seeking to find an esoteric or hidden meaning in my speech, and perhaps were inclined to go so far as to count the words in my address to discover that hidden meaning, they would find that the central and therefore most important words of my address will be coffee break. With those caveats in place, let us begin. My thesis is simple: to engage in that most active of active lives, the most important of the active lives in many ways, that of the statesman, one must engage above all and before all in its opposite, the contemplative life. The most fundamental act of the statesman is seeing clearly, seeing deeply, and seeing comprehensively. And this is only possible if we establish the practices and patterns in our lives that are conducive to seeing over time. Substituting contemplation for its conceptual cognate, we can say that no statesman can succeed in the role of statesman or even flourish as a human being without cultivating contemplation and a contemplative disposition. Neglecting contemplation will lead to grave harm to the common good and to the polity entrusted to the statesman. This claim has implications for us as leaders, as teachers, as parents, particularly in education, and how we form the future leaders in our charge, the curricula that animate our schools, and the ethos in those schools that we seek to cultivate. So first, a map. Allow me to offer a brief map of our journey over the next few minutes. Just so you'll be aware, my wife has been instructed to stand up and wave her arm if we go too long, so if she starts doing that, you'll know what's happening. First question, what is a statesman? Second, what does it mean to be contemplative? Third, what are the objects that a statesman must contemplate? Fourth, what models for the integration of the contemplative and active lives might we consider for our own lives? And fifth, how might St. Thomas More be an exemplar? And what did he learn through his contemplation that would apply to our own lives? So part one, what is a statesman? To this question, we can append several corollaries. What is the goal of a statesman? What are his means? And who or what are his chief adversaries? First, a statesman. A statesman is a wise and virtuous political leader who possesses the art of governing to an unusual degree, who is capable of directing great public affairs, and who acts for the common good rather than out of self-interest. But what is the goal of a statesman? A statesman's goal will be to bring about peace and justice for as long as these can be maintained, though realistically, the statesman will also know that in many ways these are not the norm, right? That we strive for them, but they are contingent and will not last forever. What are the statesman's means? His means are two, and we'll talk more about this as we go. First, he appeals to reason, and we'll unpack that in a bit. But he also uses lawful and just compulsion. And if we were to talk more about More's biography, I think we would find examples of both of those in his life. So a statesman publicly appeals to the personal and public conscience of free, educated, and self-governing citizens, capable of spirited public debate. So those are the citizens that a statesman will engage. The statesman will call these citizens to live generously by their highest and historical convictions as expressed through their literature and their laws. And I'll say here, literature is much broader than just imaginative literature. This would include philosophy, political philosophy. Think of Plutarch. So it's going to be quite broad. But note how literature comes first, and then laws. And we'll say more about that in a moment. And all of this, of course, is ordered to the common good. But who or what are the enemies, the chief enemies of the statesman? The statesman's primary enemies are ignorance, which of course speaks to the mind. We forget who we are, we forget what we are, we forget our nation's history. There are lots of things we would forget that could be resolved or repaired by simply learning new information or being reminded. But that's only one of the enemies. The second enemy, and I think many of us who have worked in education have experienced this firsthand, is the tendency toward tyranny and arbitrary self-assertion, which is more a matter of the will, right? You get any group of people together with a common purpose, and there's always going to be this danger, a danger of not knowing enough, but also that for the good of the cause, there will be an arbitrary self-assertion. This was something St. Augustine called libido dominandi, and both of these spring from our fallen nature. So we all, leaders of schools and families and other organizations, participate in this idea of a statesmanship to some degree. And we are all called to be contemplatives to some degree. And so insofar as we are forming future statesmen, we will need to form them to be contemplatives. So our students, even the ones who are headed toward very active lives, there's going to have to be a contemplative dimension in how we form them and how we shape them. Part 2, what does it mean to be a contemplative? We're all familiar with synonyms of contemplative. Think of speculative, think of theoretical. But notice how those last two words, though they're synonyms, they have a kind of a negative tinge, and we can talk about that in the Q&A. Why is it that when we want to dismiss something, we say, oh, that's merely theoretical, or that's merely speculative? But they're the same basic words, the same basic ideas. And I think part of that comes from the American culture, which is very Roman in many ways, that emphasis on action and practice. But that lets the cat out of the bag. What are the opposites for theoretical and speculative and contemplative? Well, it's active and practical. So these are the pairs that we're working with. But what is the essence of contemplation? So think of a ship and a crow's nest and a sailor in the crow's nest high above the ship, straining to sea, looking for land, or maybe looking for an enemy ship. It's seeing. It's that kind of deep, sustained, intentional, there's nothing more important in the world, seeing. Or think of, for those of you who know your Plato, think of the slave or the person who was chained in the cave in the Republic, who's emerged and is now seeing the really real for the first time. Contemplation is that kind of seeing. At its very core, to be contemplative is to be one who sees deeply, who sees to the very core of reality and in a sustained way over time. This seeing can be with the physical sense, but can also be with the eyes of the soul or the mind. And that's typically what we mean by this. In its higher form, this seeing is not immediately for utilitarian ends. I won't get into the for its own sake or not for its own sake discussion right now. Maybe we can do that in the question and answer period. But I think we can safely say that to be contemplative is not to be immediately moving towards some sort of practical application. And for those of us who teach, this is a problem because we're holding up all these beautiful, wonderful things for our students to contemplate and then saying, oh, we have a quiz on this on Friday, right? So you can read all the paper in the world, but then you have a quiz on paper, okay? So, it can be very confusing for students. So school, the one place where there's schole, where there's leisure, it ends up being the place of high stress and high performance, right? And that's a paradox that I don't know that we've worked out quite as well as we could. But contemplation, of course, can also be extended to action and be applied. And I believe the statesman, as I'm proposing it today, will do both of those. There will be the contemplation for its own sake, in a limited sense, but also for application. And we'll get more into this when we talk about Thomas More and his life. But the meaning of this form of contemplation can be better understood if we consider it in the form of a life. the contemplative life versus the active life. The Neoplatonist Iamblichus, in his work The Life of Pythagoras, offers this tale. Pythagoras is said to have been the first person to call himself a philosopher. He said that people approach life like the crowds that go to the Olympic Games. People come from all around for different reasons. One is eager to sell his wares and make a profit. Another to win fame by displaying physical strength or athletic prowess. But there is a third kind, the best sort of free man, who comes to see places in fine craftsmanship and excellence in action, in words, such as are generally on display at festivals. Just so, Iamblichus continues, in life, people with all kinds of concerns assemble at one place. Some hanker after money. I'm not sure what the Greek equivalent of hanker is, but that's how it was translated. Some hanker after money and an easy life. Some are in the clutches of desire for power and of frantic competition for fame. But the person of the greatest authority is the one who has chosen the contemplation of that which is finest, and that one we call a philosopher. Notice that the key action here is one of seeing for its own sake. Last night I had the pleasure of going with my family to the Front Royal Cardinals baseball game. And because their father is a professor, my children are used to getting mini lectures. I'm known to do it over the dinner table, on the way to some location, and they have different ways of coping, and I've offered to pay for some therapy as they get older. And it can be kind of a broken record. But I mentioned this because I said, I'm giving this talk tomorrow, you guys know about this, and they said, we know, we've heard about this for months. But I mentioned this story, and I said, we're going to the games. We're going to a baseball game. And so we're going, and there'll be different kinds of people there. There'll be people there selling their wares, people selling food. We enjoyed some of those culinary wares as the evening went on. There'll be people there showing off their athletic prowess. Some of them are hoping to get picked up by the major leagues. But those are people on the field. But according to Iamblichus and Pythagoras, the people who are really doing the most important thing are the people sitting in the stands, who are waiting to see the excellence of the game. And so I sort of continued the lecture as the game. I said, look, that was an excellent thing. You see that? That was a double play. That was excellent. But that's the basic idea. And I wasn't writing. I didn't have to report on the game for the local paper. There was nothing that I had to do. As a result, we simply went there for the pleasure of contemplation. And that's kind of a low level of contemplation, but it's real. And I think if we can train ourselves in our families and the people who are in our charge to do that, that doesn't mean we can just sit on the sofa all day Sunday and watch sports and tell our families, oh, I'm contemplating. Okay, that's not an excuse for that. Okay, but for those of us living in the modern world who cannot follow the model of Pythagoras, how might we understand and learn to participate in contemplation? In his essay, Work, Spare Time, and Leisure, by Josef Pieper, he offered us 4 paths. And most of us can enter into at least one of these paths. Some of us can enter into more than one. First, there is the practice of contemplative prayer. And I don't mean sort of the technical Carmelite contemplative prayer. I'm referring to what we do when we make a holy hour. All right? That's sort of silent, quiet, giving our thoughts up to God, our prayers up to God, but then also receiving back what He offers us. A kind of silent dialogue, but just being still. Okay, that's a form of contemplation, and it's a pathway to deeper forms. Second, there's the making of truly beautiful things, and this can be making fine art. It can be sculpture, painting. It can be making a beautiful garden. Right? It can take on all sorts of forms. But again, generally, it's not for some utilitarian end. You're not being paid for it. Right? No one's making you do it. But there will be a sustained sort of vision that's involved. Third, there will be a kind of sustained philosophical reflection on something that is good. This could be some aspect of culture. This could be history. It could be philosophy. It could be nature itself. But again, it's something you're interested in. And if you're asking, okay, where do I start with this? Well, what are you interested in? If you had 6 months just to study what you wanted to study, what would you study? What would you? And that would give you an idea of where to begin. But again, it's not for a test. It's not for work. It's because you have a love-inspired interest in this to grow in this area. Fourth, we can engage in the contemplation of beautiful music, art, dance, or cinema. We can go to the symphony and just listen. We can go to an art gallery, and instead of trying to see the whole museum, just go to one room that attracts you and just spend that time looking deeply. There's a couple temptations I should mention, and as a music historian, I'm hesitant to say this. I might get thrown out of that guild. But don't get caught up in the history. Okay? Don't feel like you've got to read a biography of Beethoven before you go to the symphony. Right? That information, that knowledge can come later. But just go and listen. One of Pieper's books, or it's actually one of the essays, it's called Learning to See Again. And he explores the fact that we as moderns and postmoderns have basically forgotten how to see. We don't even see what's there. And I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. In each of these, let them be born of love, be for their own proximate sake. By the way, all of these things ultimately are ordered to God. They're ultimately ordered to the beatific vision and communion with the Trinity. Okay, so fundamentally that's the ordering. But I think we know what we mean when we say for their own sake. So these are practices that current and future statesmen can learn to cultivate. And they're practices that we can cultivate in our families and in our schools by our own actions and the examples we set, but also in the ethos and the programs we develop. But you can't really engineer it, by the way. You can make time for it, but you can't make it happen. And that's kind of hard for us as Americans to hear. Like, no, I'm going to set up a plan. We're going to do this. We're going to do this. And then, boom, we're going to have a noetic moment, a contemplative moment. It doesn't work that way. I had a colleague who used to describe it as a nous inducer. Nous is sort of the Greek word for that kind of activity. You can't induce it. You can create the conditions for it, but you can't make it happen. So to be contemplative, then, is to be one who sees, not just with the physical eyes, but with the eyes of the mind and of the soul, to ever greater depths and ever greater heights. And it's a seeing that we as Christians, if we follow it to its end, will be consummated in the beatific vision. So we've begun to answer our first two questions. What is a statesman, and what does it mean to be a contemplative? So a couple questions we can all ask ourselves. Do we have a contemplative dimension in our own lives? Is there time set aside each day and each week for contemplation? If we were to choose to cultivate more contemplation, what would we do? Perhaps more prayer. It never hurts to pray more. Would we perhaps attend to learning some area that has always been of interest to us, but we've just been too busy? Might we engage in the creation of beauty? What would that be? Or might we go to the symphony or go to a museum? Part 3, what should the statesman contemplate? And by extension, what should we contemplate as leaders and teach our students to contemplate? This is not a comprehensive list. These are just a few things for us to think about. And it's a place to begin, and some of them are rather broad, as you'll see. First, I would argue that the statesman should contemplate the whole, like everything. Right? What we typically do in our lives is we focus on this one part, and then without realizing it, we make that one part bigger and bigger and bigger until it becomes, in some sense, the whole. But if you're aiming to contemplate the whole, then in a sense, you're always reminded that your space, your sphere, your area of action is part of something much bigger. And I'll say a bit more about this in a moment. Second, the contemplative statesman should think deeply about what it means to be human, about human nature, within a metaphysical context. Third, the contemplative statesman should be aware of cultural realities. And by this, I don't mean buzzwords and headlines. I mean, look beneath the buzzwords and the headlines to ask yourself, what is really going on here? What is really motivating us here? And then fourth, the political sphere. And then fifth, what we might call the eschatological horizon. Some of these are really big, but I think these are things that we need to be aware of and have as part of what we're hoping to see more and more of. Bishop and monk Eric Varden clarifies what it means to contemplate the whole when he cites Pico della Mirandola's treatise on the dignity of man. Bishop Varden writes, Pico describes God's intention in creating human nature. Having made earth and heaven, filling them with life, God longed, Pico says, for some creature which might comprehend the meaning of so vast an achievement, which might be moved with love at its beauty and smitten with awe at its grandeur. Therefore, the Almighty set all of us, in the middle of the world, as someone fit to contemplate the whole, sensitive to the connectedness of things and aware of his own rightful place among them. Wow. I mean, think about that. Pico's idea is that this is why we were made, was to look at the whole, to get a vision of the whole. That's something that no other part of creation is capable of doing. Interestingly, Thomas More, whom we will talk about more in a moment, translated and redacted a biography of Pico in his life. But this contemplation of the whole will not be a static vision, but more like a dance, in which we are open to all of reality, humble in knowing that we can only grasp a fraction of it, and moving constantly between the whole, the part, and back to the whole again. It's a dynamic vision, each time going deeper and deeper into our seeing. 2, in addition to the whole, the statesman will contemplate human nature within a metaphysical context, in communion, in solidarity, ordered to its proper end. This will be a rich and realistic view of the human person, placed within a metaphysical order, some call critical realism, the basic order and structure of our shared human reality. It will be within what Bishop Burbage, our bishop, calls radical solidarity, which is captured memorably in Father Zosima's conversion in Brothers Karamazov and the Russian idea of sobernost. If you haven't read Brothers Karamazov, I would encourage you to do so. And what I'm describing here happens in Book 6. This kind of vision of how all of reality is connected in a deep, fundamental way, and how such a vision can completely transform a human life. Following the contemplation of the whole in the human person, the statesman will contemplate the dynamic of cultural realities of his age. But his vision isn't limited to just what is. It will always be mediated by what should be or what will be. Today, this would mean understanding the struggles between a culture of transcendence and a culture of modernity. In this case, the culture of modernity is what is. And the culture of modernity works against and distorts the formation of the intellect. It places Martha above Mary. It places knowledge ordered to action above contemplation. It distorts the spiritual life. It makes our spiritual lives just consumer choices and not rooted deeply in our own nature or that for which we were made. And it distorts the formation of the social and the political spheres. A cultural transcendence, of course, will reorder that. It will pair Mary and Martha in the right relationship. It will affirm and articulate what it means to be human and what human nature is ordered toward. And it will structure the political order in a way that attends to the state, the church, and the family, and all of those other structures that are necessary for human flourishing. Fourth, the statesman will contemplate and translate these elements, the vision of the whole, the metaphysically grounded view of the human person, and the cultural transcendence into the political realm. I'm not going to talk about this right now. I'll talk about it in a minute when we get to Thomas More. Fifth, the statesman will contemplate all of these realities, particularly the political ones, in light of an eschatological horizon. Hugo Rahner quotes Maximus the Confessor thus, quote, "For this earthly life, compared to the life to come, the true divine archetypal life is but a children's game. We ourselves, begotten and born like the other beasts, we who then become children and move forward from youth to the wrinkles of old age, we who are like flowers, which but last for a moment, and who then die and are transported into that other life, truly we deserve to be looked upon as a children's game played by God." I think this is part of the double vision that Matt mentioned earlier, of switching back and forth. The political, yes, we're committed to the political. It's really important. The work of our daily lives, really important. But we never forget that second tier, that second vision of the eschatological horizon. What is this challenge in my school or my family or in this political campaign or my organization? How does it look in relation to what's to come? What the ultimate first things? All right. Let's move on to part 4. What are 3 models for how to think about the relation between the contemplative and the active? So if you followed me thus far, maybe you're saying, okay, I'm willing to grant maybe the contemplative and the active should be united in the life of the statesman, maybe in my own life, maybe in the life of my students. What are some models of how to think about this in a deeper way? I'll say there are basically 3 types of models. One is the biblical model. The great tradition of biblical interpretation has taken Christ's words about Mary and Martha and basically said these are types of lives, the contemplative and the active. And Mary chose the better part. But what do we do with that? How do we understand that? Another emphasis of this, and this goes all the way up to Dante, is that Rachel and Leah. Rachel tended to be proposed as a model of the contemplative life, and Leah was the active life. And Jacob, of course, loved Leah first, right? So there is a hierarchy. So the biblical tradition, first of all, gives us a priority. Affirms both as important, but gives a priority there. Second is the patristic model. Julianus Pomerius noted, and he was writing just after Augustine, a generation or two after Augustine, noted that there are at least three ways to think about the contemplative and the active lives. One of the ways to do it is to simply divide up society and say, well, these people are going to be contemplatives and these people are going to be active. You can do that with religious orders. These are the active religious orders, these are the contemplatives, or these are the contemplative orders, and then we have everybody else who's living in the world. Another way to think about this is to simply say, and this was alluded to earlier, basically this life is the active life, and the life to come is the contemplative life. So that's another way to divide this up. Or Pomerius says you can try to combine them in a single life, which isn't easy, even though that's what we're talking about today. Also from the patristic period, St. Augustine has some things to say about this in The City of God. He emphasized our freedom to choose, first of all, that we can choose the active life or we can choose the contemplative life. But then he provided cautions. All right? He said, no matter which one you choose, there's some things you've got to remember. First of all, whichever one you choose, you have to preserve faith, living in conformity with the commandments of God, avoiding all that is indecent or self-indulgent, and never overlooking the claims of truth or charity. So that covers both kinds of lives. But then Augustine has some cautions about those who might choose one or the other. He said, for those who live the life of contemplation, they must never forget the service they owe to their neighbor if the neighbor is in danger. If your neighbor is in danger, or your spouse, or your children, or there's a crisis, you put down the book and you go help. That's the practical application of that. That's what you have to do. He also said, quote, the charm of leisure must not be indolent vacancy of mind, but the investigation or discovery of truth. When I'm teaching undergraduates about leisure, this always comes up. They have this idea that somehow leisure or contemplation is just this sort of mindless, staring at the wall. And that's not what this is. It's a kind of active receptivity and receptive activity. It's a cycle. It's a circular motion. But it's active, but it's a deep internal activity. But it's not just vacancy. So if this is there are certain activities that people might say, oh, I'm engaging in leisure when I'm doing this, but is your mind completely shutting down while you're doing it? Then that's not leisure. That's not contemplation. But for those who choose the active life, he writes that no man, quote, has any right to be so immersed in the active life as to neglect the contemplation of God. Right? We can't ever be too busy to pray. Right? If we're too busy to pray, there's something profoundly wrong. And furthermore, in the active life, and this will hit close to home, I think, for some of us, it is not the honors or power of this life that we should covet, since all things under the sun are vanity. But we should aim at using our position and influence, our prestige, if you will, if these have been honorably attained, for the welfare of those who are under us. It's okay to have honor, all right? It's okay to have prestige or high position, but remember what it's for. Remember what it's for. If one chooses the life of contemplation, it must be properly limited to the true needs of service and charity. If one chooses the life of action, it must always be limited by the needs of contemplation and of prayer in the spiritual life. There's a third model I want to mention, and it's not one that people commonly think of, and it comes from Cardinal Newman in an essay. Most people know the idea of a university, and they often get a wrong idea of what Newman believed about education by just reading that book in isolation. He wrote a number of other works on education that are extremely important. One of them is called The Rise and Progress of the Universities. He's got some essays on St. Benedict, and that's the one I'm referring to today. It's The Mission of St. Benedict. Cluny Press, which is an amazing press, just put out a new volume, a new edition of this. In it, Newman speaks of three phases of the Church's history. The first phase he called the Benedictine, and he associated that with poetry. The second one is St. Dominic, and that's more of a kind of intellectual system building. Think of the Summa Theologiae, think of high scholasticism. And the third is the Ignatian, and that's going out into the world. That's the active life. He makes a point that they're like nested Russian dolls. They build on each other. So that is to say that if you pursue the Ignatian life, if you pursue the active life, at the very core of your being, there have to be contemplative practices. There has to be a contemplative disposition. Here's what he says, quote, what the Catholic Church once has had, she never has lost. She did not lose Benedict by finding Dominic, and she still has both Benedict and Dominic at home, though she has become the mother of Ignatius. Things incompatible in nature coexist in her. And I would say that things incompatible in nature can coexist in us through the grace of the Church. that God grants us. So, most of us are engaged in the Ignatian life, the active life, but are we cultivating that Benedictine core? I think those are questions to ask. Now to the final section. Part 5. How might St. Thomas More be an exemplar for us? And what are some of the things, not all the things, but what are some of the things that he learned through his contemplation? Previously, when considering the things that a statesman or anyone else engaged in contemplation that might have a public role should consider, we skipped over the political side. So I'm going to begin by giving you a bit of background on Thomas More. There's a wonderful book, an author, Jerry Wegemer, that Matt referred to earlier. This book is entitled Thomas More and Statesmanship. This is an excellent text that I think it would be a great place to go if you're wanting to learn more about Thomas More, the statesman. Following his formal schooling, Thomas More gave an additional 15 years to study, particularly in history and political philosophy. So when he could have launched out into the world and left all those studies behind, he continued on for at least an additional 15 years, reading as much as he could, studying as much as he could. He didn't leave the contemplative life behind in the sense of learning. He juggled this program of self-education while leading a very active life. And this is something also very interesting that I found in his biography that I think is key. He lived for 4 years with the Carthusians, a contemplative order in London, and spent at least part of every day praying with the monks and adapting monastic practices to his own daily rule of life. Traces of this time can be found, particularly in his biography of Pico della Mirandola. This work creatively appropriates the life of Pico as a means to adapt monastic piety and practices to a secular context. Then, even after he entered full-time public service and married, he continued to integrate the contemplative and ascetic dimensions into his own life, devoting himself to prayer and study. From his student days and continuing into his adult life, More pursued the path of what we would call the ongoing conversion and the cultivation of the interior life, assisting at daily mass, engaging in meditative lectio divina, practicing mortification, and participating in the divine office, among other things. Thus, More seems to have embodied and carried out what St. Augustine called the composite pattern of living, transposing the rhythms and rituals of the cloister to a life shaped by the demands of public service. But this was not easy, and certainly was countercultural. More himself, and there are those in the room who can say much more about this, was part of an intellectual movement, a larger movement called civic humanism. And there was a tension between this. Do you retire? And I think certain writings of Plato would give you this idea that the philosopher really should retire from public service. And though in an ideal situation the philosopher will rule, that's probably not going to happen. So the philosopher should step aside. And More and his colleagues really pushed against that and said, there's a responsibility to serve in the city or the state. And so he did that. He found a way to bring those together. But he did this in interesting ways. Surprisingly, given the demands of public service, he set aside Fridays in particular. Writing in his Life of More, William Roper, Thomas More's son-in-law, observed, quote, "And because he was desirous for godly purposes some time to be solitary and sequester himself from worldly company, a good distance from his mansion house, builded he a place called the New Building, wherein there was a chapel, a library, and a gallery, so that on Fridays, there usually continued he from morning till evening, spending his time only in devout prayers and spiritual exercises." Right? So there was no playbook for this. He had to figure this out. But that's one of the things he did. But note that Thomas More, for him, contemplation was not just prayer, but it was the deep seeing of anything that was good, either directly created by God or indirectly made through the goodness of human making. If it were just prayer, he would not need more than a chapel, right? But there was a chapel, there was a library, and there was a gallery, right? So the definition here of contemplation is broader than we might think. But what was the fruit of this contemplation? Here we can fill in the political content that we alluded to earlier, and I'll move through these things somewhat quickly. First, among the fruits of contemplation, More emphasized the primacy of personal virtue in both leaders and citizens. And this is key to what we're talking about here today, the primacy of virtue both for leaders and for citizens. And the idea that there is no institutional substitute for virtuous citizens and virtuous leaders. We can't build the perfect mousetrap so that everyone's lacking in virtue, and yet the state runs along as it should. There's no substitute, either an absolutist prince like Machiavelli, or some sort of Hobbesian arrangement or social contract theory. None of those things are really going to solve the problem. So a statesman has to be wise and virtuous. But what's the primary adversary? What's the enemy that More would acknowledge for this? And he would say pride. So I think the homily this morning was apropos about the dangers of pride. And pride not only fought, Thomas More not only fought pride in his own life, he set up and arranged the education of his children in such a way so that it would work against pride. And for him, pride was the primary problem in terms of losing political liberty. So we had to safeguard against that. A second fruit of More's contemplation was that everything we build is temporary. The goal of the statesman is to bring about peace and justice for as long as these can be maintained, though realistically, these will be for brief periods of time. And I think that's a particular danger for those of us who build organizations and schools, other nonprofits, and do other things. We know in the back of our minds, this is contingent, this won't last forever, but it's so easy to get caught up in making something that you hope will last forever. So I think a wise view is to say, no, this will last as long as God allows. And that changes everything. That changes everything. And More understood this. Build it like you hope it will last forever, but also recognize that God has set a time on all things that are mortal or made by mortal beings. A third fruit for More, drawing upon St. Augustine, would be the dangers of ignorance and libido dominandi, the desire to assert oneself in ways that are unjust or inappropriate. And a fourth fruit of More's contemplation was that reason and public dialogue are essential, but just force may also be necessary. So, how do these things work together? More really believed that the statesman would appeal to reason, publicly appealing to the conscience of the citizens, the rational powers of the citizens, who were free and also educated, and capable of self-governance, capable of governing their own lives, and then calling them to live generously according to their highest principles and historical principles. And these things would have been expressed through laws and literature. Think of the way that the Odyssey and the Iliad shaped the Greek mind of a certain period, and it was a sort of reference to action, right, and to how one should live. It was that kind of calling to literature and laws, I think, that More, at least in part, had in mind. And a final fruit of contemplation that I want to say a bit more about is this thing about literature. I think it's extremely interesting that literature, in this case, which I think are letters and humane education, for him was in some sense more important than law, right? Because think about what's happened since Dobbs, right? Laws can now be made or changed, but the culture, the stories of our culture, the literature of our culture, is preventing us building a culture of life immediately, right? We have a lot more work to do on the cultural side. This idea that politics is downstream from culture isn't exactly what More is saying, but the ideas are related. There is a dynamic here that we have to think deeply about as statesmen and as teachers and as leaders. So, in conclusion, I think we can ask, how might we integrate the contemplative life, the contemplative dimension into our own lives as leaders in whatever sphere God has called us to? How might we integrate this dimension into our schools? Not only the curricula, not only the books we read and the subjects we teach, but in the ethos of the classroom. Is there a dimension for contemplation in the classroom that's not ordered to grading, or is every single thing you do all day long, every school day, some sort of ordered to some assessment that you have to fulfill? Is there room for this kind of rest, if you will, in the good, the true, and the beautiful? And do we have any of that in our own homes? That's a hard thing to maintain, especially with small children. But as they get older, they tend to get distracted and get busy. So it never really slows down organically. One solution is to think about technology. Another solution is to think about Sundays. Can we use our Sundays in a different way to build this out? Speaking for myself, I'd like to do as Thomas More did and build a cabin on my property and retire there every Friday. In fact, but there's only one problem. I have to ask my wife. She's here. Can I do that? You allow me to do that? We have to talk about this. Look, that's what I'm getting. So others of us may take up the patterns developed by religious orders, maybe a third order Dominican. You might borrow on the spirituality and the rule of life of very old traditional orders. Or we might draw upon the patterns of life that have been developed in more recent movements and apostles of the church. Many of the apostolates and movements that grew in the church in the last 100, 200 years, even though many of them are very much ordered to the active life, they've maintained the presence of a contemplative dimension. And so I think that we have a lot to learn, and we can bring out treasures both old and new. But whichever way we follow, I hope we'll keep in mind St. Thomas More, keep him top of mind. Remembering the fruitful life of statesmen, leaders, parents, and even students will not be possible without integrating, cultivating, and guarding the contemplative dimension. And just a last word. I'd ask you to remember two things. As important as the work of Martha was, Mary chose the better part. And that now we see through a glass darkly, but then we will see face to face. Let us begin today to prepare for that seeing. Thank you.